solid lease agreement just isn't a piece of paper. It's your legal shield and the foundation to a successful landlord-tenant relationship. Now, without a detailed and enforceable lease, misunderstandings and disputes can arise, potentially costing you time, money, but peace of mind. If you skip the details or rely on generic templates, you could leave yourself exposed to disputes, unpaid rent, or even legal trouble. Let's break down how to create a lease agreement that works for everyone. So before we start, I always like to share some stories, and I'm going to share some experiences that I see when we take over from a landlord or from another property manager. And there are two different types of leases that I've seen. One is so basic of a lease, it's practically handwritten on a napkin. And I'm being serious. I've seen some that are written on a piece of loose leaf paper, that paper that we used in grade school, all the way to something so complicated, it was literally written by a lawyer. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but you have to remember the context of what you're trying to do here. If you have a lawyer draft a legal agreement, that might be okay depending on your states. Let me preface that by saying we're in Canada here, province of Manitoba. So all leases here have to abide by the Residential Tenancies Act. If you're in a province or state that it doesn't matter, then by all means, you could have a lawyer draft the agreement. Problem with that, of course, and what I've seen is it's so complicated, I can't even understand it. And if I can't understand it, how are you going to ask and request your tenant to understand it? And if they're not willing to sign it, or they think there's some kind of hidden clause in there that's going to get them either evicted or paying tons of extra penalties and rent, good luck trying to get them to stay. Because really, it's all about creating trust and relationships, as you've heard me talk about on this podcast. So let's talk about the key components of a lease. You need the rent amount, when the rent is due, your start and end dates, and you could even have things like payment methods. Now, also think about what's included and what's not included. So on our standard lease, we would have what utilities are included. So let's say there's a section that says tenant will pay, let's say they're paying all utilities, heat, hydro, water, tenant's contents insurance, okay? Where the landlord might be paying either heat, hydro, water, building insurance, right? Maybe there's something in there about who's paying for intranet, maybe it's included, laundry. So you want to really dig deep into anything that you could want the tenant to do or that you are responsible for. More to the point, we're not just talking about utilities. It could be who's doing the grass, who's doing the snow. Maybe you want an extra addendum or even a place on that lease for furniture or other inclusions. So you might be saying, well, I don't have a furnished property, but still you might put something there like fridge, stove, washer, dryer, dishwasher, microwave, extra freezer in the basement. Seen that a lot, right? The chest freezer. Pretty well anything that you don't want to be accidentally leaving with the tenant when they move out. Now, I'm going to caution you as well, because this is what I've seen. You have to be very careful at what you're wanting to include. So let's take the example of your chest freezer, and let's pretend that this was your personal house, okay? So you move out of your house, you've got the extra freezer in the basement, or maybe it's the beer fridge, or maybe it's the bar fridge, or the extra fridge that you were saving for the cottage. And you're like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to leave it there. It's an incentive for the tenant. But keep in mind, anything that you are including in that lease, you have to fix. Okay, so let's take the example of the chest freezer. So you're going to have this chest freezer. It is, 20, 30 years old. It was working. And then, of course, that's to be included in the lease. And then it stops working. Okay, who is responsible for paying for it? You are as a landlord. Let's pretend that you put something. You have an agreement with the tenant. You know what? This is an old freezer. When it's gone, it's gone. I will not be repairing it. That is exactly something that you want to put into the lease agreement. Some kind of, some kind of section where it might say landlord agrees to supply existing chest freezer and agrees that the chest freezer will not be repaired when it is end of life or something like that. Now, preface that again, check your local regulations, because what I just said is legal in Manitoba, but it might not be legal in your state or province, okay? So rent amount, the due dates, start and end dates, and anything that you want in there that could be included as inclusions: barbecues, snow blowers, shovels, lawnmowers. I mean, the list goes on. This is a legal binding document. Security deposit. Some leases have a spot for it, some don't. What I would encourage you to do, most states and provinces have a regulatory body, and most of those regulatory bodies have an example of their lease agreement. For example, in the province of Manitoba, the residential tenancies branch has the lease agreement on their website. It's very good. It's not, I would add to it definitely, but for our purposes, as a starting point, it's good. And what's more important in that lease agreement, and this is where it's really important to delineate from having a lawyer do it and then use your regulatory body's standard lease agreement. The reason I say that is this. There's a fine print, in our lease agreement from the residential tenants branch here in Manitoba, where it says the lease and all terms are going to follow the RTA, the Residential Tenancies Act. If it didn't say that, then you'd literally have to put every single clause that you'd want in there, such as what happens when there's a sublet, what happens, what is the required amount of the security deposit, what are you allowed to do with pet deposits, what are you going to do with warning letters, the tenant's right to quiet enjoyment, your right as a landlord to make sure that they pay their rent on time. All of that is written into the Act, the Residential Tenancies Act, and I'm reasonably confident that if you check your state or province's laws, there's going to be some kind of, again, fine print that you can include on your lease agreement that is going to also include that. Because, the Residential Tenancies Act is hundreds of pages long. I'm registered as a broker in the province of Alberta, same thing. You want to make sure that it's kind of like one sentence allows you to have absolutely everything and the protection of the Residential Tenancies Act. On the flip side of things, your lawyer could write out this 15-page document, also include the Residential Tenancies Act clause in there, but you might even be putting something in there that is against the Act. Okay, so just because your lawyer says we're going to be collecting first and last month's rent doesn't mean that province or state allows that. For example, in Manitoba, we're only allowed to collect 1/2 month for security deposit. Yes, it's true, only a half month. We can't collect first and last like some other states and provinces. So even if I were to put that into my lease agreement, and even if the tenant signs it, drafted by a lawyer, duly witnessed, dated, it won't stand up in court or in our residential tenancies branch hearings because it's an illegal clause that goes against the Act. Okay, so it's really, really important that you research your Residential Tenancies Act or whatever your regulations are. And again, I'm suggesting that you use your lease agreement template as a starting point. Now, when we talk about other terms and conditions, okay, we talked about tenant and landlord responsibilities. What about pets? And with pets, you want to put not only if you're allowing pets, my advice is to put and include what type of pets and how many. If you're talking about dogs, don't just put 2 dogs, put 2 dogs, medium or smaller. 2 dogs, no more than 20 inches at the shoulder. 1 dog, 1 large dog, no more than 40 pounds, plus 1 small dog, no more than 10 pounds. Or be really, really specific, because when you visit your property in 3 months and it said there were 2 pets allowed, I do know some landlords that say 2 pets and they're thinking 1 cat, 1 small dog, and you have a Great Dane and a Mastiff, right? Tearing up the house, tearing up your hardwood floors. What other things do you want in your lease? Well, you want a clause there about subletting or assignment of lease. What are the rules and regulations around that? Now, in the province of Manitoba, because we are putting in subject to all rules and regulations of the Residential Tenancies Act, the Residential Tenancies Act refers to subletting and that type of thing. Let's talk about customization now. So you can customize anything you want as long as it's not against the Act. Now, what I'm recommending to you is to create some kind of addendum, Schedule A, whatever you want to call it. Rules and regulations is what we call it. Then you can basically put 1 line in your, let's say, 2 or 3 page lease. Please see signed document referred to as rules and regulations. And in there, that's where we're saying the garbage receptacles have to be kept by the back door. Recycling has to be on a certain day. no removal of smoke detectors, no water beds, no wall-mounted telephones. I'm laughing because that actually is still a part of our standard lease rules and regulations, no wall-mounted telephones. And I mean, that really dates us, right? So that's how long I've been doing this when we actually had wall-mounted telephones. Unless you're in a really, really old house that might have had that wall jack where there's a wall-mounted telephone, I really don't see any of our modern tenants going back to a wall-mounted telephone. Maybe a note to self that I have to remove that. All humor aside though, you can put almost anything that you want in there, okay? In ours, give you some examples, no marijuana products, okay? Maybe you're saying you don't want smoking, no smoking of marijuana, but you're okay with edibles. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. We include vaping because that also causes smells and different things like that. So we say no smoking, no vaping, no marijuana products, which really encompasses quite a few things, okay? What are some of the other things I'm thinking of in there? Okay, here's one. We're in Manitoba. I'm looking out the window here. It's snowing, minus 15 degrees, beginning of December. We're heading for our typical January with minus 30, minus 40 degree freezing temperatures. So we have it as a clause in our rules and regulations that if the tenant is to go away, they have to shut the water off in their house at the meter, and they have to ensure for insurance purposes that a responsible adult is visiting the property for security reasons to make sure that nobody's broken in, no water's leaking every 48 hours. Now, unfortunately, in the province of Manitoba, we are not really allowed to enforce that, but still having it in your rules and regulations, it's not against anything in our act. We just can't hold somebody responsible for not having these checks and balances. What the insurance company will then tell us, if the tenant is not there at that period of time and they're wanting to deny the claim, then at least we created a conversation with that tenant. And what that's also going to do when they read that is, well, what do you mean by this? Let's clarify. And then you can really, really dig in there and unpack that for the tenant to say and reinforce, yes, you have to have this because we have seen this. We need to have somebody be there. And if they're like, well, I don't have any friends and family there, then you might be able to strike a side deal and say, okay, fine. We'll put in here that you have to let the landlord know when you're going away for more than 48 hours. And then I will personally come there and make sure that I'm doing the checks because it's your property. You want to also adjust any clauses to comply with any local laws. So those could be bylaw infractions. It could be noise. So we have a noise clause in ours that says no noise after 10 o'clock, quiet time between 10 o'clock and 7 o'clock. Again, anything that you can put into your rules and regs and your lease acts as a basis for later for you to say, okay, you didn't comply with this one line. Now I'm giving you a warning letter and 30 days notice if to terminate your lease if you have another infraction. Infractions, that's another podcast. You're welcome to check out some of my videos on the YouTube channel. I do talk about warning letters and mediated agreements. But today we're just going to try to keep within the scope of leases. Property-specific policies. What are we doing about parking? I mentioned noise. You might have a different noise rule for a house versus a fourplex versus an apartment block versus a townhouse versus a duplex. Okay. Legal review. You want to have your lease reviewed. Depending, I wrote here in my notes by an attorney, a real estate attorney. I'm going to say, again, don't take my legal advice. So I think to cover myself, I will say, make sure your lease is reviewed by a real estate attorney. But from a common sense point of view, if you are adapting the lease from, again, the website of your regulatory body in your state or province, it should be a very good starting point. You may or may not need or feel that you need to have it reviewed by your attorney, depending on how much you have modified it. Okay, so that's kind of the starting point. Whether you choose to have an attorney review it is really up to you. If you are in a state or province that does not have that template, then absolutely I would get an attorney to review it or help you write it with the proviso that you actually want to make sure it's written in very clear layman's language so it's not scaring off anybody. And it allows you to go through those rules and regulations or whatever's in that document with your tenant just to clarify things. I talked about clarifying things, so clarity is the key. Avoid the legal jargon, write in plain, clear language that both parties can understand. So I think you've got a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. In summary, you want a well-written lease, set clear expectations. This is going to protect your rights, a smooth rental experience, and really get yourself onto the right foot with the tenants. A good rental agreement is going to cause a discussion and allow you to really dig into those things that you want to clarify with the tenant. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. You might also be interested in downloading our lease agreement template, which covers all of the essentials. It can be customized for your property. So click the link in the show notes to get started on that.